A wedding night is supposed to be the most intimate, most cherished moment in a woman's life. The veil has been lifted. The guests have gone home, and the vows are still fresh in the air. For her, however, that night became the opening chapter of a nightmare. The banquet had been lavish, the gown dazzling, the applause endless, but all of it was a hollow performance. Behind the smiles and blessings lurked whispers about a love that should have been about a woman who no longer stood at the groom's side, yet still lived in his heart. When the door of the bridal chamber closed, she leaned into the embrace of the man she had just sworn to spend her life with. But in his drunken haze, he murmured a name softly, tenderly, one that wasn't hers. It was the name of his past love. That single slip shattered her world like glass. What began as a dream wedding turned into a cruel reminder. She was not his one and only, but a shadow cast by someone else's memory. This is the story of a wife who loved deeply, endured silently, and finally chose freedom when love meant nothing but pain. The wedding had been the talk of the town. Guests whispered about the splendor of the decorations, the wealth of the groom's family, and the beauty of the bride. But beneath the glittering chandeliers and the intoxicating fragrance of roses, there were murmurs, persistent, lingering, sharp as knives. If only she were here. They spoke of a woman from his past, a girl he had once loved so fiercely that her absence became a ghost, haunting every corner of the celebration. She smiled through it all, holding her bouquet tighter, her nails digging into her own palm to keep the tears from spilling. She told herself love could be nurtured, that marriage itself would soften his heart. Perhaps, in time, she could replace the phantom of that lost love with her own presence, her own devotion. But reality announced itself brutally on their wedding night. As the champagne wore off and the music faded, he stumbled into her arms, kissed her with lips heavy with alcohol, and whispered another name. Not hers, never hers. She froze. Her body went cold, her mind blank. She stared at him, hoping she misheard, but he repeated it again, softly, as if comforting himself with a memory she could never touch. That moment was not an accident, nor a drunken mistake. It was truth unveiled. She was not his bride in his heart, merely a stand-in, wearing the gown that belonged to another. The following days only confirmed what her heart already knew. On their vanity table, beside her jewelry box, he placed a framed photograph of the woman he once adored. Every morning he gazed at it as if drawing strength to survive another day. Every gift he brought home seemed to echo the preferences of someone else, floral patterns she didn't care for, books she would never read, perfume too sweet for her skin. None of it was for her. It was for the ghost she was forced to embody. Life in that mansion became a performance she could not escape. The staff looked at her with pity. Relatives whispered behind her back, and even the silence of the hallways pressed down on her like judgment. She realized she was not a wife, but a placeholder, not a partner, but a replica. And though her marriage had just begun, her heart was already withering in the shadows of another woman's name. Her days quickly slipped into a routine of humiliation. At breakfast, he would sit across the table, his eyes distant, his fork stirring absent-mindedly, while his phone lit up with old photos, old messages. At night, when exhaustion weighed her down, he would sometimes mutter in his sleep always the same name. Each syllable pierced her heart like a needle, reminding her that no matter how she tried, she was living in a role written for someone else. She tried to win his affection. She cooked his favorite meals, arranged his schedule, even endured the subtle disdain of his relatives, who still worshipped the memory of the one who had gone. But nothing worked. When she dressed elegantly, he compared her silently with the other woman. When she made mistakes, however small, he sighed as if fate had cursed him with the wrong bride. The cruelty was not always lauded, lived in silences, in glances, in absences. One evening, when she was feverish and weak, she reached for him, desperate for comfort. But he sat at the edge of the bed, scrolling through a gallery of photos of his lost love, unaware that his wife was shivering under the covers. The climax of her suffering came during her pregnancy. For the first time, she dared to hope. Perhaps this child would tie their lives together. Perhaps it would anchor him to the present instead of the past. She whispered prayers into the night, holding her belly as if shielding a fragile dream. But fate was merciless. Complications struck, and she was rushed to the hospital. Lying pale on the hospital bed, her hands cold, she searched the hallway for him. She wanted to believe he would burst through the doors, frantic and terrified of losing her. Instead, he stood outside, clutching the framed photograph of his old lover, tears streaming down his face for a memory, not for the woman fighting for his child. Her world crumbled. The child she carried did not survive. The grief should have united them, but instead it split them further apart. He mourned silently, not for their lost child, but for the life he imagined with another. And there, in the sterile white of the hospital room, with the sound of monitors beeping faintly in the background, she finally understood. Her suffering was not temporary, not accidental. It was the foundation of her marriage. She was condemned to a life where every breath she took, every tear she shed, would be overshadowed by another woman's name. The sterile smell of the hospital clung to her skin long after she was discharged. The emptiness in her womb was mirrored by the emptiness in her home. She moved through the mansion like a shadow, haunted not only by her loss, but by the realization that she had been invisible all along. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into his study. The desk was scattered with papers, but what caught her eye was a diary. Its leather cover was worn, its pages frayed from years of use. She hesitated, then opened it hand with each line. The truth dug deeper into her heart. Page after page chronicled his undying devotion to the woman who came before her. How he loved her laugh. How he planned to marry her. How her absence left him broken. And in the margins, fresh ink bled with longing pleas to fate to return her. Prayers whispered to the past. Not a single word about his wife. Not a single acknowledgement of the child they had lost together. The diary fell from her trembling hands. In that moment, clarity pierced through the fog of grief. She realized she had been fighting a war she could never win, battling not a living rival, but a memory enshrined in his heart. Memories never age, never falter, never disappoint. She could cook, clean, sacrifice, even bleed for him, but she could never compete with the perfection of a ghost. Standing before the mirror, she saw herself clearly for the first time in years. Her eyes were hollow, her shoulders bent under the weight of unspoken pain. Yet, somewhere deep within, a flicker of resolve stirred. She thought of the nights she had wept silently, of the child she had lost without his hand to hold hers. And she whispered to her reflection, enough. The decision was not impulsive. It was born from years of silent suffering, crystallized into certainty by the diary in her hands. She gathered her belongings, quietly jewelry she had bought for herself. Letters she had written but never sent, a single photograph of her lost child. When dawn broke, she placed the divorce papers on his desk. She didn't wait for his reaction. She didn't need to. For the first time, her heart was light, her steps steady. The chains that bound her had been cut, not by his remorse, but by her own awakening. She walked out of the mansion, not as a broken wife, but as a woman reclaiming her dignity. When he woke and saw the divorce papers on his desk, his first reaction was disbelief. Surely she wouldn't dare leave. For so long she had endured everything: his neglect, his indifference, his worship of another woman. He believed her love was bottomless, her patience infinite. He thought she would always be there, waiting, hoping, forgiving. But the silence of the house told him otherwise. Her closet was empty. Her shoes were gone. The faint scent of her perfume had vanished from the air. For the first time, he felt the weight of her absence, and it was crushing. Days turned into weeks. He searched for her, but she had cut every tie. The family whispered about the scandal, but their pity was no longer directed at hurt, was reserved for him. The man who lost a loyal wife because he clung to a ghost. At night, he sat in the study with a diary of his past love, but the words now mocked him. The memory that once gave him comfort now burned like acid, because no memory could warm an empty bed or soothe a guilty heart. He began to wither. His health declined, his business faltered, and the admiration that once surrounded him dissolved into ridicule. In the end, he was left alone with his regret, a man surrounded by wealth, yet bankrupt in love. Meanwhile, she flourished. Free from the suffocating shadows, she built a life of her own. She moved into a small apartment filled with sunlight, took up a career she had long abandoned, and surrounded herself with people who valued her for who she truly was. The pain of her lost child would never fully fade, but she carried it with strength instead of despair. There were nights when she remembered the sound of him whispering another woman's name, and instead of breaking her, it steeled her resolve. That memory was no longer a wound, it was a scar, proof of what she had survived. Retribution had already played its course. He lost her not because she stopped loving, but because he never chose to love her in the first place. And her liberation came not from his apology, but from her own courage to walk away. In the end, their fates diverged like two roads under the same sky, one leading to loneliness and ruin, the other to freedom and self-respect. And for the first time, she realized the most beautiful vow she could ever make was not to a man, but to herself. This story is more than a tale of heartbreak, is a mirror held up to many women who have lived in the shadow of someone else's memory. Love should never feel like a cage. Marriage should never feel like a stage where you are forced to play a role written for another. And yet, how often do we hear of wives who give everything, time, youth, even their bodies, only to discover that their husbands' hearts were never truly theirs. Her journey reminds us of one truth: endurance is not the same as love, and sacrifice does not guarantee respect. By walking away, she did not lose, she reclaimed. She reclaimed her dignity, her freedom, her right to be more than just the substitute. To every listener who has ever felt invisible in love or overlooked in family, remember this: your worth does not depend on someone else's recognition. You do not have to compete with a past, nor live in the shadow of another. You have the right to step into the light, to claim your own story, and to write an ending where you are not a victim, but the victor. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who may need the reminder. You never know whose silent pain could be eased by hearing these words. And don't forget to follow this channel for more Bạch Nguyệt Quang stories, tales of women who suffered, who endured, but most importantly, who chose themselves in the end. Because at the heart of every story, the message is the same. Do not live as someone else's shadow, shine as your own light.